Dunce Down Under, January 8th, 1996. Dear Fred and Father, I couldn't stand the strain any longer. The thought of my dear old mother walking out to the mailbox in the bitter cold of winter, looking for her worthless son's letter describing his trip to Australia, and finding it empty, finally got to me. Of course, I've almost forgotten the entire trip. Well, not really. A story is like a fine wine with an almost dreamy quality to it. To think that I survived for a total of 13 days in a foreign country on less than $300 of chump change in my pockets still amazes me. I could easily have spent that much on gruel and grog alone. I must have practiced moderation. More like feast and famine, because as you know, moderation would not be part of my religion, if I had one. The trip started out the same as the one to Japan, an hour from Omaha to Denver, 2, maybe 3 hours to Los Angeles, California, and then a long, torturous 14-hour non-stop to Sydney, Australia. I knew I was in trouble when one of the passengers sitting next to me asked the stewardess how much longer the flight would be, after 10 hours in the air, and she replied, "We're almost there, about 4 more hours." I have never been very good at sitting still, but you probably already knew that. When you arrive in Sydney, you are sent through customs at the international port of entry and then bussed to the other side of the airport to catch your domestic flight. From there, it's another 5 hours to Perth, which is on the other side of the continent. At that point, not only was I able to smell me, I'm sure those around me could too. I was kicking myself for letting the travel agent book me in a seat over the wing. My view was somewhat limited. I politely asked the stewardess if it would be okay if I changed seats. She said, "No problem, love." That's just the way they talk. I don't really think she wanted me. Once we were underway, she offered to take me to the observation deck. I thought, heck, if they have a spot out on the wing, I'll be happy to go. As it turns out, the deck is the cockpit. I spent half an hour talking with me mates up front. I couldn't have asked for a better view. The plane was brand spanking new. I wanted to fly it and almost asked, but I thought that might be going a bit too far. Once we arrived in Perth, I headed to the taxi stand, wondering how much it would cost, when a Chinese gentleman asked me if I'd like to share a cab. Already the gods were smiling down on me. Or perhaps it was just those two dead spirits, Peter J. and the boy. But they wouldn't have sent a limo. A beer truck would have been more their style. It was a long drive, which gave me the chance to tell my tale to the driver and the Chinese guy. I explained to them that I was there for an artificial intelligence convention, and the company I work for refused to pay for it. So, quite naturally, they felt sorry for me when I asked for suggestions as to where I could find a good campsite. The Chinese gentleman wouldn't accept any money from me, but I insisted on tipping the cabbie $5, thinking that would be appropriate. They both remarked that Americans tip too much, so I learned a valuable lesson. I went to the registration table at the convention center and tried to pay them in cash. I had already converted $900 of my $1,000 into Australian currency, keeping an extra $100 bill in the emergency compartment of the travel pouch Father gave me. I also hid the $50 Fred gave me in the "I'm in big trouble" compartment, also known as my shoe. The registration people, however, wouldn't take cash. But they let me register and trusted me to pay them later with a cashier's check I could purchase from a bank. Purchasing a cashier's check was going to be enough of a hassle, but I was in for an even bigger shock. As you know, I've never been much of a detail man. I thought I could register for the conference for 245 Aussie dollars, but that was the student rate. I couldn't lie to them and pretend I was a very old student after they were entrusting me to pay them later. I was obligated to pay the 740 Aussie dollars, plus an additional 60 for the ceremonial dinner on Thursday night. After doing the math in my head, I thought, there goes 2/3 of my $1,200. Or was that $1,300? Not to mention my hidden stash of loot. Oh, this money part of the equation of life has always confused me. When live for the moment is one's mantra, there's no need for forethought. Just use it up until it's gone is my philosophy. I had money hidden in special places all over my body, but the only thing I was sure of was that the big bills, of whatever denomination, seemed to be dwindling fast. Somewhat shocked at my miscalculation of the cost, I asked the people at the convention center if they thought it would be okay if I camped over in Kings Park, a 400-hectare park adjacent to the university, stretching all the way down to downtown Perth. They looked at me, stunned, and recommended the college dorms across the street. I said thank you very much and headed to the nearest pub, deciding I'd ask for another opinion. I walked into a nearby pub at about 1 or 2 in the afternoon. Because I hadn't slept much for the past 48 hours, I was somewhat punch-drunk to begin with and didn't look very presentable. But before I could even take my backpack off, the owner was telling the barmaid to pour me a beer, and the first one was on him. I liked that place. I said I would have a Foster's, as it was the beer of Australia. The owner almost bit off his tongue when he heard that. He laughed and said something to the effect that I was obviously not from around there. The barmaid brought over a small glass filled with beer, about half the amount compared to an American glass. When I stated that I thought all beers in Australia would be big, like a can of Foster's, he just shook his head and made a discouraging remark about American TV commercials and the Crocodile Dundee movies. The bar owner moseyed over and we talked about where I was from and some of my misconceptions about the land down under. First of all, Foster's was not the favorite beer of Australians. They just exported it to the United States because nobody in Australia would drink it. Secondly, if we served you a large beer, you would only end up drinking warm beer, and we wouldn't want that now, would we, mate? Thirdly, most people in Australia drink bitters, which is more like a high-octane alcoholic ale than beer. He was a very interesting fellow who had traveled extensively in the United States. We seemed to hit it off, so I thought I would seek his advice about sleeping in the King's Park that night. He gave me another stunned look and said, quoting verbatim now, "Oh, mate, we couldn't allow that. We'd have every bastard in the world sleeping over there." So much for asking. I was exhausted, the sun was still shining, and I was really beginning to smell. I must admit that after a little walkabout and checking out the park situation, I went back to the college and found a bed and breakfast room for $39. Just call me weak. I took a shower and crashed. I woke up at 3 a.m., unable to sleep because of the time zone changes. I thought it would be a good time for another walkabout through the park to explore the possibility of locating a secluded campsite. I dug out my dog training whip, and off to the Australian bush I went. Whatever was in there would not take me quietly in the night. The bush of the Australian west coast was a little more rugged than I had anticipated. The King's Park was more like a jungle than a park. There was a full moon shining overhead as I beat my way through the brush, clutching my little whip like a sword. I could feel the fear creeping up my spine. Perfect. I knew right then the park would be home for the next 5 nights. Clutching my whip, I tried to settle myself down because the adrenaline was overflowing. It was pretty spooky at first. The bush was filled with all sorts of strange sounds that took a little getting used to. I looked around and read the terrain, utilizing the moonlight the best I could. My training with search and rescue dogs had taught me at least one important lesson. There was a path. There is always a path. It's just whether you want to take it or not. Within a short time, I found the perfect campsite. Having made my decision for the coming week, I followed my current footpath through the underbrush until it delivered me close to a road that led back to the college. With the location marked in my mind, I continued my stroll at a leisurely pace, enjoying the night air and the freedom of movement. Once back in my room, I read a Star Wars book, a purchase from the airport, and waited for breakfast. Jeffrey. March 13th, 1996. Dear Fred and Father, sorry about the 2-month delay in getting this short story to you. In the interim since I began writing, both Taylor and Courtney have had the plague. Court didn't eat anything but ice chips for 3 days, and Taylor managed to break his wrist while playing basketball, just before he started puking for days on end. Trust me, the list goes on and on. Anyway, back to Australia. Breakfast was included with the room that first morning in Australia, and as I ate, a sense of desperation began to fill me more than the food. I always make it a habit not to count my money until it's gone. It makes sense when you live day to day. But no matter how I sliced it, I knew I was on the edge. As I enjoyed my all-you-can-eat meal, I pored over the pre-course material that was part of my $800 entry fee. I was shocked to discover that the in-depth, half-day discussions on genetic computations and evolutionary computing were an additional $200 each. It was at that moment that I flashed back to an old TV series called Kilroy Was Here. When you're old like me, you remember these shows. It was about a guy who wanted an education but couldn't afford it. He would disguise himself by impersonating paying students, using the art of invisibility in order to attend class for free. I imagined myself using the same free principle for all the lectures that cost an additional $200. But it's not easy to disguise yourself when you're lugging your hotel and life support system in a pack on your back. Invisibility wouldn't work, so my approach would have to be different. Being more like a man with brass-plated balls, I decided to choose a lecture I wanted to attend, barge in about 5 to 10 minutes late, plop my gear in a corner, apologize with a quick nod and hand gestures to the presenter, find a chair in the front row center, if I could, sit down, keep my mouth shut, and pay attention. It's true that when you have to pay for something yourself, you put a little more creativity in your effort to learn. So I did. Extend effort, that is. The learning part could be debated. I was prompted by the fact that this education was already costing me over $2,000 and rapidly approaching $3,000. I spent 4 days in classrooms attending lectures on all types of artificial subjects. The best and brightest professors and international authors of the day were calling it intelligence. I'm not so sure. It was definitely a way to store logic and pass data via an electrical process. But the information that comes out the other side, is it intelligence or just another point of view? In my heart, I wanted to be outside exploring the foreign soil of the west coast of Australia. But my head kept saying, "Pay attention, you paid for this." I couldn't take it anymore. I broke on Thursday. That was the day I realized I needed a photo session on the beach more than I needed another lecture. Man does not live by artificial intelligence alone. Sometimes you have to feel something to understand it. And as far as I know, the sense of touch and the sixth sense of feeling it from the soul are going to be the last 2 frontiers of computer science. I knew on Friday afternoon I'd be heading for the train station, and my only chance to swim in the Indian Ocean would be that Thursday. I waited to leave until after lunch. Lunch was part of the admission fee and the highlight of my day. I caught a city bus, bullied my way through the crowd with my backpack, and asked the driver to take me to the nearest beach. I have one basic rule when I travel alone: never leave your pack behind. With my usual luck, I could get close, but it still left a death march wearing my pack to reach my goal. It was worth it. Being alone and thinking of sharks, I swam further out than I should have, bobbing up and down like a fat cork in a sea of salt. I just let the waves tumble me back to shore. I would have played longer, tempting the great whites, but my father's warnings about the intensity of the sun down under were right on target. The sun was brutal. I even sprang for a new set of sunglasses while I was there, having forgotten mine in the States. Purchasing a pair of sunglasses may not sound like a big deal, but to me, $15 was a major expenditure. After my stint in the ocean, I needed to get back to the university. The big dinner reception for the conference was that night. I had seen photos of the supposedly authentic Australian working ranch where it was being held, and I wanted to take some of my own pictures. While waiting at the bus stop for a city bus whose schedule I didn't know, I spotted a bar-restaurant built into the side of a cliff. On the deck overlooking the ocean was a group of people yelling for me to come and join them for a pint. Now, that was a very tempting offer. It was hot, and I thought, oh, what the heck, nothing wrong with a quick one. I stood there wearing my pack as the sun baked the salt into the pores of my skin, and internally debated the issue. Yeah, right, I thought. A pint would take about an hour to drink using one of those little glasses they were so proud of, and I recognized a trap when I saw one. There was nothing self-delusional about my ability to reason logically. After all, I had just been trained artificially. Considering my options, I was almost ready to join them. Probably would have been an adventure in itself. But as luck would have it, a cab came around the hill on a lonely stretch of road by the beach. I hadn't seen one the entire time I'd been standing there. I was in a quandary. Should I go join these Australian partiers or not? It seems to be the question of my life, and usually there is no question about it. Go, of course. However, I wanted that $60 meal I had already paid for at the beginning of the conference. To make sure I would arrive in time, I waved a thanks anyway to the mates on the deck, flagged the cab down, and spent another $20 on transportation, instead of libation. Good decision in the heat of the moment, so to speak. The taxi driver tried to convince me to move to Australia. He commented that my hat would fit right in, and that I looked like I had just come out of the bush. Little did he know that I had been living in the bush. In retrospect, I'm glad I did take the cab. I wouldn't have wanted to miss the shindig that was about to come. It was one spectacular event. The university provided us transportation to what truly was an authentic working ranch of Australia. I was on the first bus to arrive. As I stepped off the bus, this dude with 12-foot whips, one in each hand, started cracking them over his head. The next thing you know, a cowboy on a horse came charging toward the group of exiting passengers, stopping in a cloud of dust and shouting, "G'day, mates!" Off to one side, a group of cowhands were branding a calf that was bawling at the top of its lungs. Clusters of ladies were spinning yarn under the awning of an outbuilding next to the main house, while the hired hands were shearing the sheep for yarn. The huge house, where 5 generations of Aussies had labored to live, was surrounded by a porch and built in the Australian style of, well, Australia. There was an aborigine in a field tossing a boomerang, which actually came back to him. Before long, there were at least 200 stunned, wide-eyed scholars from all over the world, versed in the art of advanced evolutionary computing, standing around like a bunch of gringos. Having been raised around hoopla of this kind as a kid, and having parents who grew up in the Badlands of North Dakota, I've seen people work a ranch as if their lives depended on it. I must confess that I was somewhat jaded by the staged activities. It was a hoot, don't get me wrong, but it was more like production of a play than real life on the ranch. I was, however, somewhat fascinated by the guy with the boomerang. As a kid, my attempts at this particular sport were more like a child without a dog playing fetch the stick. I began to roam the area so I could find a place to stash my pack, not wanting to leave it unguarded on the bus. Walking by the dude with the whips, he asked if anyone would like to try their hand at cracking them. To be honest, I thought he was kidding. Having worked protection dogs, letting them bite the sleeve on my one arm and whipping them with the other, one thing I learned was that the damn things could take your eye out before you knew what you did wrong. Before I realized he was actually serious, there was a line of willing participants, all wanting to try the whips. I was surprised that no one lost an eye. When it was my turn, I showed him my whip, and he laughed, saying, in so many words, that a person would have to be awfully close to the animal to use that thing. He was right, of course. Different strokes for different folks. I mean, animals. Time passed quickly as we toured the ranch, and before a person could see everything, it was dinner time. The Aussies did it up right. We had a selection of venison, kangaroo, emu, goose, clams, oysters, wine, beer, and who knows what other delicacies. I only know that for the last 5 days, I had been surviving on snacks from our 10 a.m. tea breaks and the daily lunch included in the conference fee. I definitely ate my money's worth that night. After dinner, we had a huge bonfire. 2 aborigines began blowing wooden horns, and a few more began swinging things around their heads, making an eerie hooing noise. It was like a scene from the Crocodile Dundee movie that the bartender had been so quick to scorn. The grand finale was the obligatory dance around the fire. The only event left was the bus ride back to the university. It was long but comfortable, in a secure seat that lulled me to sleep. No snakes, no spiders, no reptiles, no hooting owls, no squawking birds, well, I'm not sure what else was in that bush. But as they say, all good things must come to an end. I'm not sure why they say that, but I guess we would never know how good things were if they never ended. As the other attendees disembarked from the bus and headed for their rooms to crash in their respective spots of luxury, I casually walked toward the park, pack on back. When the lack of automobile headlights allowed, I plunged into the utter darkness of the bush and headed toward a small natural clearing that I had utilized as my home away from home. With a quick flop and plop, I bedded down for the night amongst the buzz of bugs outside my tent. The bowel movement the next morning reflected the previous night's indulgence. Normally, when I broke camp, it was a matter of jamming all my gear into the pack as fast as possible before the mosquitoes attacked. The bush was thick with them. Then I would make a bum's rush to a nearby gas station for a civilized constitution. But that day, we, meaning the bugs and I, had to do outdoor duty. Now, to most people, you may think that simply means defecating in the woods. Well, let me remind you, it was not the woods. It was a jungle, or the bush, as the Australians like to call it. The mosquitoes zeroed in on exposed flesh as if they had never tasted Yankee blood before. There was nothing I could do but take the hits like a man. Putting DEET on something that close to the vitals would have been more dangerous, not to mention more painful, than the bites. I broke camp and did the best I could to make sure that no one could tell that I had ever been there. I forced myself to go to the morning lectures at the university and then headed for the train station. I was going home. It was a great feeling to be on the move again. Since I was running low on money, I walked the 10 miles from the university to downtown Perth. It was a hump and the temperature was in the 80s, but I really enjoyed it. Once I reached the Indian Pacific Railway station, I thought I had everything under control. My only problem, besides only having about $200 left, was that there were no cheap seats left. It turns out that I had to rent a sleeper for an additional $33 per night. The sleeper was worth every penny, but now I was left with less than $100. The train took 4 days to cross the continent. They said it would take about 3, but as luck would have it, they were working on the tracks, so they had to reroute us. I had forgotten how it felt to be trapped on a fishing boat for hours on end, but believe me, that torture as a child was excellent training for this journey. I started pacing up and down the aisle, but even after 2 days of that, all I could do was sit and stare out the window. I must admit, though, I met some very interesting people. My bunkmate was a 50-something Englishman. I met Swiss, South Africans, Japanese, and even some Australians. The steward on the train was very kind to me. We had talked during the first day, and that evening he asked me why he hadn't seen me in the dining car. I was too embarrassed to tell him that I was saving the last of my rubles for the stay in Sydney. I just said I was trying to watch my weight, and there would be plenty of time to eat later. Trevor, that was his name. Funny how those little memories just pop up. Looked me in the eye and smiled. He said they had cooked a few extra steaks by mistake that evening, and would I like one? Coincidentally, they made that same mistake every night I was on the train. It almost brings tears to my eyes when I think back to just how kind he was. There was another incident that brought more than tears to my eyes. It brought fear and adrenaline. I met a guy from Seattle on the train who worked for United Airlines. His hobby was to travel all over the world and write articles for a train enthusiast magazine. He was an interesting person, probably 30-something. He had spent the previous night pouring expensive gin down a female Japanese tourist. Having wasted all of his fine liquor on her, with no results, he needed to replenish his supply so he could try his luck again. He asked me to make a run to the nearest pub during our scheduled half-hour stop at Broken Hill in Queensland. He explained that he would go himself, but he wanted to take some pictures of old trains while we were there, and hell, I wasn't doing anything. Besides, any movement with purpose would be a welcome relief from the mile after mile of sitting on the train in the Australian desert. I said sure. When the train stopped, I hoofed it across the main street to an old gambling house, thinking they'd have off sales. They didn't, but told me where I could get some. I went out the back door, crossed the dusty alley of a long-since mined-out mining town, and purchased the liquor. I was on my way back through the gambling house when I tossed in a few 20-cent pieces in a one-armed bandit. I'll be damned if I didn't hit 100-to-1 return. Well, at that point, I thought the spirits of Peter J. and the boy were smiling down on me. Now, someone with average intelligence would have grabbed the winnings and hightailed it back to the train. But never having been accused of being average at anything, I quickly tried to build my bundle. It didn't take long before I was out of luck. And my winnings. My dead friends must have been sleeping. I went outside, thinking that I hadn't come close to using up my allotted time before I needed to be at the train station, when I happened to look across the street and saw my train pulling out. I had violated my own rule, never leave your pack behind. Everything I owned, in Australia, was on that train. I ripped the sandals from my feet, shoved them in my day pack with the 3 bottles of whiskey, gin, and vodka, and ran like few have ever seen me run. I leapt like a Marine over a 6-foot spiked fence surrounding the train station, but it was even better considering I was still wearing the day pack with the assortment of hooch in one hand. I was planning to fling myself to the side of the train, like one of those suction cup Garfield cats you see stuck to car windows, and I wasn't going to let go until they let me in. As I was wildly trying to put the backpack on, which apparently was going to be my survival kit, I noticed something. The train had stopped. I thought perhaps they had seen this crazed American running barefooted across the desert and were stopping for me. That was not the case. They were only moving the train further down the track to attach a few extra cars from one line and hadn't even started boarding yet. Needless to say, I didn't leave that train again until we reached Sydney. I didn't have to. After the guy from Seattle gave up on the Japanese girl, I helped him drink the liquor that had taken several years off my life. As we were laughing about it, a couple of rich South African kids came by and we started talking. They had come back to the club car to see if there was any action. The Seattle guy and I were it. They very graciously invited us to join them up front in the first-class coach. Being an American from the Midwest, I am not used to the formalities of train travel etiquette, but since I had already hooked up with a train expert, it didn't take long to be educated. As you may already know, the cars in front are reserved for the rich folks. This tradition dates back to the days of burning wood for fuel to make the steam engines run, and the soot would blow back onto the passenger cars. The further your car was to the front of the train, the better off you were, as the smoke would billow out and over the front cars, due to the draft, before being sucked back and down over the cars further back. Well, these kids were way up front. We stopped at their compartment to retrieve their stash of premium liquor. The bottles had labels that I couldn't even pronounce, let alone spell. But that's not saying much. Their cabin was a spacious affair that comprised about 1/8 of a train car. It had a double bed that disappeared into the wall when folded up, leaving a very large seating area during the daylight hours. At night, the double bed would undoubtedly make traveling a lot more comfortable than sleeping in a bunk above a stranger. Once the top drawer liquor bottles were safely secured for transport, we headed even further to the front, where the rich people have their own dining car and lounge. Talk about nice. The entire car was handcrafted in a deep, rich mahogany wood. They even had their own bartender. We spent hours telling stories and drinking expensive liquor while the bartender made sure our glasses were never empty. He was more like a gentleman's butler. Not that I have ever known any, but he would occasionally break protocol and join our conversations. I must admit that this was the first time that I have spent any length of time with an openly gay, but not soliciting individual. He was a big man but had a high-pitched voice. He was a gentle and kind person. It gave me a totally new outlook toward gay people. It took me 43 years to realize that there is simply a genetic difference in all of us. No one has the right to label those people one way or another. Strange how a person thinks you need to spend hours in lecture rooms to learn, and then you find the simplest wisdoms in the strangest places. Wisdoms like, don't leave the train unless you have to, and don't judge people by the labels other people place on them. I must say, the South African rich kids were very prejudiced when it came to race, and also made comments and innuendos about the bartender, who was openly gay, but not soliciting. I gave the kids a chance before I judged them. Their bigotry appeared to be more a function of youth and upbringing than of nationality. But in my mind, ignorance is no excuse, young or old. You don't make fun of people who won't deny their core being. It angers me. But then again, before I climb up too far on my high horse, I must admit that I wasn't so pure and noble that I wouldn't drink their whiskey, which, by the way, was very good. Finally, after 4 long days and what felt like a previous life, I was in Sydney. I found a post office to mail the postcard that I bought in Cook, one of our 3 stops across the entire interior of Australia, making sure that it was a legitimate post office so no thieving bastards could steal the stamp off the postcard to my dear old mother. Which, by the way, must be the reason you never received those postcards I sent from Japan. Wait, they don't have any thieves in Japan? Oh, perhaps I forgot to send any. Well, after mailing the postcard and assuring my proper place in the will had been restored, I headed for the Sydney Opera House, a must-see in anyone's book. Sydney is a city of many sights, sounds, flavors, and flowers, but too big for my taste. Following much walking and gawking, I had an intense desire to hightail it out of there. All I wanted was a beach to pitch my tent and to sleep. I inquired as to the possibility of such a place at the travel bureau, and the tourist lady said that 7 Mile Beach, which was 70 clicks, metric slang for kilometers, away would be a great spot. She explained which train I needed to take, and that my scheduled ETA would be about 6 in the evening, perfect for pitching a tent and enjoying the ocean. There was only one problem. Once on the train, I missed my stop. It wasn't my fault. The train was crowded with people commuting home from work in downtown Sydney. We had traveled quite a distance to the end of the line when I noticed everyone exiting the train. The conductor had made an announcement, but damned if I could figure out what he said. It was as if he was speaking in a foreign language. If only it had been American English. As it turned out, he was announcing the next stop for passengers to change trains in order to continue the next leg of the journey. To make a long story short, as I was sitting on the train looking out the window at all the people boarding another train, the one I was on began moving back the way we had come. At first I was in shock. Then I decided I should react. I grabbed my pack from the overhead compartment and rushed down to the train doors. If you can picture this, I was standing by the doors, trying to pry them apart so I could leap, pack and all, from the moving train. Luckily, as I was pounding and kicking at the doors, the conductor calmly walked up, handing me my passport and the pouch Father had given me to hold all my important papers and money. It appears that, in my haste, I had left them on the seat next to me. The conductor simply shook his head in disbelief, and I played dumb when he asked me, "What in the hell are you doing, mate?" I told him I was from Nebraska, my handy-dandy answer for all errors in judgment, but it didn't buy me as much as a flicker of recognition down under. He virtually dragged me up to the front of the train and made me wait with him until we came to the next station. He then told me to exit the vehicle and stay on the platform until another train came along going the other way. Well, as you know, I have never been one to wait. I grabbed my pack as soon as the train pulled out and headed down the road. Nobody was going to tell me to wait. Besides, I could always hitch a ride. That was about 5:30 p.m., and no one picked me up. No one in their right mind would have. I reached the train station where I should have transferred at 8 p.m. that night. The sun was going down, and I still had to go another 20 kilometers by train before I could even begin to start walking the additional 6 clicks to the beach. When I finally reached my destination, it was about 9 p.m. The wind was blowing, the moon was glowing, and the clouds were moving in. As I was walking up a hill, fried like a crispy critter and totally despondent because I had messed up, I spied an oasis. A little pub. There's a picture of it somewhere because I remember snapping one off to make sure it wasn't a mirage. And it literally begged me to enter and have a beer. Money was short, but not that short. I just want to state for the record that Peter J. and the boy were still with me. That's where I met Colin and his friend Patrick. They were arguing about how they would decide who was the best golfer when they planned to play a round on Saturday. I sat and listened and chuckled when they settled on the bet. The loser had to run naked through the country club's clubhouse. We started talking, and they started buying me middies, their word for a short pint of beer. This worked out well. As far as funds were concerned, I was just steps away from begging. I told them where I was headed, and they immediately started arguing about whether or not it was 6 or 9 clicks away. I really didn't care. I knew it was going to be another death march, one way or the other, and after a while, you just take them in stride. No sense crying in my free beer about it. At closing time, Colin made me a very generous offer. He said that he owned a farm by the ocean, and if I liked, I could pitch my tent there. Well, I have pictures to show the choice I made. I chose the intoxicated Colin over the walk in the dark, even though I had just met the man. I knew very little about him, except that he was willing to run naked through a clubhouse full of rich people to pay off a bet, should he happen to lose. My kind of guy. More balls than brains, I suspect. Sometimes you have to go with your gut in these situations, and my gut said he was okay. Colin was quite the character. I would say a typical Australian, but then again, I don't know enough of them to compare. Only the ones I had seen on TV or met on this trip. We hopped in his truck, and the next thing you know, we were rocketing down the wrong side of the road. Well, it was the wrong side to me. We somehow made it to his ranch, and he invited me inside to have a few more of the bitters. He roused his wife out of bed and convinced her to make us something to eat while we watched the late-night telly. His wife was very tolerant and more than kind, considering the fact that she had just given birth to a baby boy the week before, that it had to be after midnight, and Colin and I were 3 sheets to the wind. I was talking to her in my slurred, I'm not really drunk, but just talk funny speech, watching their 4 cattle dogs and 3 cats milling about, checking out the stranger from the land above, when Colin suddenly jumped up from the couch and said he would fetch his 4-wheeler. By this time it was well past 1 in the morning. The wind was starting to howl, and, periodically, the Southern Cross and the moon were being swept away by the clouds. The next thing I knew, Colin was grabbing my pack, and we were heading out the door. I swung my pack onto my back and hopped on the 4-wheeler behind Colin. After that, it was pretty much hang on for my life. I was so scared I almost had to drop my beer so I could cling tighter. You must understand that no road trip is complete without a fresh beer in your hand, and Colin made sure I had one before we flew out the door. We raced around his ranch, blasting through meadows and creeks and playing chicken with some of his old charolais, beige cows, big, mean, and nasty. We had a stare-down with one mama cow with her calf huddled behind her. She started to paw the ground. Now, I've been around enough cows and cowboys to know that this creature, snorting at us in the wind, with her head down and her red eyes shining in the glow of our headlights, was not kidding. Colin just laughed at her and spun out of there just as she charged at us. I swear I could feel her hot breath on my neck. But then again, all stories get better over time. Every now and then, as we were pounding over an open field, we'd hit some big-ass rock and literally go flying into the air, with Colin shouting, "That was a rock!" and me laughing like a madman from the sheer insanity of the situation. And possibly the beer. He drove me up to the cliffs that formed his eastern boundary overlooking the ocean, and pointed to a spot. He proceeded to tell me that one of his mates went flying off into open space at that spot and met his maker. I wonder how that happened. It was quite windy up on the cliffs, so Colin drove me down to the cove along the ocean and helped me pitch my tent. He pointed to the lights of his house off in the distance and said I was welcome to come back for breakfast in the morning. And then he was gone. That was the last I saw of Colin. I would have returned for breakfast the next day, just to thank the man and his wife once again for their hospitality, but the rain stopped me. Yes, that's right, rain. I tried to wait it out, but by noon my tent was beginning to leak, and I needed to use the outdoor facilities, so it was apparent that I was going to get wet one way or another. I realize a detailed explanation of one's use of an outdoor facility is, well, not really a subject for polite conversation, but this one was memorable. It was not only raining, but I lacked the necessary equipment. To be truthful, I don't think a person has totally experienced the wild until they have had to strip their socks off while standing in the rain so they can take 4 swipes at her. That's right, you can turn them inside out. A vivid memory to be shared, I guess. The rest of the day, I walked along the beach at Garrygong and explored the town in the rain. It wasn't miserable. I liked it. My early training in these conditions began during construction of the family homestead on the lake in Minnesota. Rain didn't mean you quit working. It only meant you got wet. Since it was my last day and I didn't want to miss my flight, after sitting in a croquet club casino for about 2 hours drying out and nursing a couple of bitters, I headed back to Sydney. As before, it was a walk to the local train station, and after a long ride back in foggy drizzle, I ended up late evening in the downtown Sydney train station. I thought about taking a walk and camping on one of the local beaches, but I wasn't sure I could reach the airport in time the next morning. Other than me, there were only the street people and the constables milling about. With only a little over $10 left in my pocket, I was wet, tired, and about $25 away from the airport. I was ready to ask a cabbie to drive me $10 worth toward the airport, thinking I'd walk the rest of the way. I started to look through all my paraphernalia one last time, checking flight times and such, when guess what? There was that emergency $50 bill that my mother never let me leave home without. I found it hidden away in my secret, really, really emergency reserve hiding place in my backpack. I had removed it from my shoe long ago, since I was beginning to wear a hole in the money from walking on it, and had forgotten about it. I was in hog heaven. I thought about finding a cheap room or a pub, but decided against both. I was in full drive by then. All I wanted to do was go home and be with Diane. I just wanted to lie down next to her in our own bed and once again feel safe and secure and loved. I wanted to hug my kids and tell them stories about things they shouldn't do. There is no other feeling like it in the world. Going home. And since clicking my little wet tennis shoes together didn't work, I guessed I would have to do it the old-fashioned way. So I caught a cab to the airport after asking the cabbie if he would accept American dollars. He did. At the airport, I politely knocked on the locked doors. The guards, who were very nice, opened the doors and allowed me to sleep on the floor. The next morning, I ate like a pig on my newly found wealth and bought 2 books for the long flight home. That's pretty much my trip in a nutshell. There was only one other significant moment that I experienced at the airport. The trip, as you know, was for business. At least, that's what I will tell the taxman if he ever asks about the expense write-offs. To be honest, Virtual Knowledge Inc., and I, as their representative, did learn about artificial intelligence and its potential to help mankind go forward into this brave new world. And I, personally, learned many lessons about humanity during those 13 days. But somehow I was not satisfied with the trip. Academia, in my mind, was somewhat of a disappointment. The professors and the self-proclaimed doctors of intelligence spoke the fancy language. But once you catch on to their lingo, you begin to notice that they are not very heavy into the actual walking, just the talking. Being a doer and a self-proclaimed idiot savant, more emphasis on idiot than savant, I have always had a need to do. So I did. And as a final tribute to the land down under, I had my very last cigarette outside the doors of the Sydney airport. In my book, it doesn't get smarter than that. So perhaps my quest for intelligence was not in vain. Jeffrey.